Hello, everybody. Good afternoon for us that are in Houston. Good evening for our Greek friends participating and are attending our event today. On behalf of the Hellenic Professional Society of Texas, I would like to welcome you to one of our events online at this time of the year. And it's a lecture. Before I introduce Konstantinos Varvarezos, I would like to give you a couple of announcements concerning our society. So the first thing I would like to say is that for our members and our friends, please save the date. This will be our general, in lieu of the potluck event that we organize, and it's one of our favorite events of the year. We get together online by Zoom. So the tentative date is October 17, and we'll have to discuss a couple of issues at that time. So we will send you the link and the specifics for that day. A second announcement I would like to make is I would like to thank everybody who has been paying their dues for the new year. The ones who have not done so, please send us the dues. You know, the society, the only income of the society is the member dues, and everything. All of our events and all of activities are supported by those dues. You can pay by PayPal, you can send a check, or email us and let us know if there is any other way that it's convenient for you to do that. So I'm very happy today to welcome Konstantinos Varvarezos. There are various reasons for me being happy. One of them is that there's the new, actually HPST members, the new, because Katerina and Dimitris Varvarezos, they've been members and in the board for many years now, and it's very exciting to see the kids now joining the society and being volunteers to give us so interesting lectures. Konstantinos Varvarezos is a PhD candidate in mathematics at Princeton University, working in the areas of knot theory and low-dimensional topology. He's a native of Houston, and he completed his undergraduate studies at Rice University, where he also studied linguistics and classic Greek. He's especially interested in historical linguistics and the history of the Greek language. So without further ado, I would like to welcome to the virtual podium, Konstantinos.
So today I want to talk about some aspects of the early history of the Greek language. So the title is Indo-European and Pre-Greek. So those are the main two sort of sides that I'll talk about. And just to give a brief overview of what the talk will be about. So what is the Indo-European side? So Greek belongs to a family of languages called the Indo-European language family. And this is a language family that includes many languages of Europe, as well as India and the Middle East. And all of these languages are related to each other and part of this larger family. And they have an ancestor language, the mother language, so to speak, of all of these languages. We call it Proto IndoEuropean. So in the first part, I will talk a little bit about the connections of Greek to the other Indo-European languages and how we know that it belongs to this family. And then the next part I will talk a little bit about is sort of the development from this common Indo-European into what is called Proto-Greek, which is the common ancestor of all Greek dialects. And so sort of what features Greek sort of developed that makes it unique and different from the other Indo-European languages as the speakers sort of branched off from the rest of the Indo-European branches and the speakers came to Greece. And finally, as those speakers were coming to Greece, they came in contact with another group, the so-called pre-Greek speakers. That means that the languages that were spoken in Greece before these Proto-Greek. So important to distinguish between Proto-Greek versus pre-Greek. Sometimes it can be confusing. But when I say pre-Greek, I mean the people or the language that was spoken in Greece before it became Greek, before the Greek speakers arrived, so to speak. And we know that this language was there because there's evidence for many words in Greek that have origin in that language instead of from Indo-European language. All right, and just I'm going to introduce a few sort of terms in case you don't know, maybe you already know, but sort of important to know is, for example, when I say that a word is inherited, so I'll have a lot of words and example words. So when I say an inherited word, I mean a word that's passed down within a language. Oh, is there someone chat messages? Oh, yes. Oops. So an inherited word just means a word that sort of comes down from an earlier version of the language, straight down from that. For example, Old English brid turns into English bird. Or, for example, Latin is the ancestor of Italian. There's a Latin word caelum, and this becomes cielo in Italian, means sky. Or, for example, the ancient Greek mation becomes modern Greek mati. So these words are all inherited because they sort of continuously exist within the language. They may change over time, but it sort of comes down from the mother language. Another way a word will enter a language is borrowed from another language. These are called loan words or borrowed words. Just some examples again: French facade gets borrowed into English sad. Or, for example, the Ottoman Turkish word papuç is the origin of Greek papuci. Because they had a word from another language and gets borrowed, just called a borrowed word. And I'll also talk about cognates. So two words are called cognates when they are words from two related languages and the words themselves have a common origin. So, for example, English ship and this Dutch word schip, it was not borrowed from one language to the other. They just came from a common origin because the two languages are related. Similarly, French and Spanish, they both came from Latin. There's this word chèvre and this word cabra. They both come from some Latin word for goat. And yeah, those are called cognates. So that's just some terminology. So now I wanted to show you how big this Indo-European language family is. So I claim that Greek belongs to this large family that includes Anatolian languages and Tocharian languages. Those languages are not spoken anymore. But also including Italic languages like Latin and all the Romance languages, the Celtic languages that include Irish and Welsh, Indic languages like Sanskrit and modern languages like Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, etc. Iranian languages like Persian. Armenian is also in this family. Germanic languages like English and German. Baltic and Slavic languages like Lithuanian and Russian. And also Albanian. So these are the main, I guess, like 12 main branches of this Indo-European family tree. And as you can see, there's the mother language, the sort of common ancestor of all of them, is called Proto IndoEuropean. This language was spoken a long time ago, probably at least 5,000 years ago. And I will talk a little bit about how we know some things about these languages and how we know that they're related. So why are they related? So I claim that we can find a lot of cognates, that is, words that are similar and mean similar things in many of these languages, especially numerals. So numerals, you don't expect that these are going to be borrowed from one language to another. And if you stare at this table a little bit, you'll notice some patterns. So just looking at the first row, the word for two in Greek, Sanskrit, like most of these languages starts with some sort of D sound. In Gothic, there's a T, and that's sort of interesting. But in most of them, it starts with a D. And the vowel sort of is like a U-esque vowel as well. But okay, just not focusing on the vowel as much. But to say, if we just focus on the initial consonant, let's look at the next number. We see that in Greek and Sanskrit and Latin, we have this T, in fact, the TR for 3. And in fact, many of the other languages, but in Gothic, for example, there's this sort of th sound, this sort of funny symbol is like that. Th. So 4 is a little bit more complicated, but again, you see that a lot of these words have a similar form. across all these languages. So if we look at 5, we see a P, 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 and then Latin is a little bit strange. But then the Gothic has an F, and then these other ones also have a P. 6 and 7 have an interesting pattern, that in Greek they have this H sound, so-called rough breathing in the front. Whereas in many of the other languages, this is actually an S in the beginning of the word. We look at, for example, 8, we can see correspondences between this K sound in Greek octo, for example, Latin octo is the same, but Sanskrit and sort of like half of them have a sort of a K sound, but some of them have this S sound, whereas Gothic has this H. And similarly, we see this for deca, 10, the K corresponds to a C in Latin, but in Gothic is an H, and in Sanskrit, for example, it's sort of this S sound. 9 is also very similar, they all have an N. So the point I'm trying to say is that these patterns that we notice are sort of regular. So if you see a K, for example, in Greek, you expect maybe an H in like Gothic or an S in Sanskrit. And this sort of repeats over and over again. And these are sort of regular sound correspondences. Here I put the English words just so you can also compare. But yeah, Gothic and English are both Germanic languages. So there's this interesting pattern where you see a lot of Ds in the other languages, but you have a T in English, for example. And then, yeah, so on for the other examples. And most of the time I will be using this sort of Greek script for the Greek words. Just had this Latin transcription at first so you can notice the pattern more, but I'll switch to this more traditional script. So just to summarize some of the sound correspondence that I mentioned, for example, this D, 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 but a T in English, or the K and S and the T and the TH, for example, in 3 we see a T versus a TH in English. Let's summarize some of them here in this little table. So for example, we saw this correspondence, for example, in the number 5, starts with a P in Latin and Greek with a pi, but in English we have an F. Similar for the T sound, you have T in the other languages, but a TH in English. For the K sound, slightly more complicated, but usually we see a sort of a K or a C in Latin, and then an H in English, and this sort of S sound in Vedic Sanskrit. And the delta, the D sort of sound, again, they have it in common between Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit, but it's a T. You expect a T in English. So in fact, this sort of slight deviation that English has a special name. It's called Grimm's law, and it happens to all the Germanic languages actually. But knowing these sort of patterns, this allows us to find many, many more cognates. So the numerals, again, we expect that they shouldn't be borrowed, so this is a clear sign that these languages are actually related. And I guess there's one more. So we saw in the numbers 6 and 7, Greek has this so-called rough breathing symbol. This is, I guess, called a lesia. Supposed to indicate like an H sound that used to be there, and this corresponds to S at the beginning of a word in the other languages. So now that we've seen these sound correspondences, suddenly we can notice a lot more vocabulary in common. So, for example, other words that we expect should not be borrowed are family words. So here's a word for father. Again, we see this P, 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 but English F, the T, 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 but English TH. Similar for mother, you see the T's. The M is, of course, preserved in all languages, but the TH in English. We have a word for daughter. This has an interesting new correspondence. We have this D in English, a D and an H in Sanskrit, but we have this theta here in Greek. Similarly, we have a word for brother frater, we have this F, a B in English, but a BH in Sanskrit. And this corresponds to a Greek word, frater. It doesn't exactly mean brother, it sort of means like a member of a tribe or brotherhood, but there is this word that is related. The other word for brother in Greek has, again, we see this phi corresponding to a BH Sanskrit. So some other vocabulary that these languages have in common are religious words. So we can find, again, this pattern appearing in, for example, the name of this sort of sky god, so Zeus. If you know that Zeus, in the other cases, starts with a D. So we have Dios, for example, in the genitive. So again, we see this delta corresponding to a T in English. So Tiw is a god in a Germanic mythology. Tuesday is named after him. Similarly, we have Deus, God in Latin, Deus in Sanskrit. So DDD, but again, the English T. And I just want to remark that this also gives us some insight into the religion and the culture more generally of these Indo-European people, because we know they had this word in common. This sort of sky god was very likely a major part of their mythology. We also find this word for a serpent in Sanskrit, and this is supposed to be a Vestan, Haji, Ahi, corresponding to Greek Ophis, which is a serpent. And this also indicates that there was likely a myth of a slaying of the serpent or slaying a dragon type a myth was important to their religion as well. We can also find a lot of words for related to pastoralism and agriculture. For example, the word for a cow. So you can see at least Greek and Latin, both are very similar. And then we see this sort of interesting correspondence in English, the C in English, but a G in Sanskrit. We have a word for a dog. So we see this sort of pattern that we saw before, the K in Greek and Latin, with the S in Sanskrit and the H in English. The word for yoke, yugum in Latin, yugam in Sanskrit. So yeah, so we see this other correspondence now, this gamma in Greek corresponding to a G and a G in Latin and Sanskrit, but a K in English. We have a word for horse. We have hippos in Greek. Old English has el. This word did not survive into modern English. The Latin, for example, we have equus, and Sanskrit ashwa. So now we see some interesting pattern between this QU sound and the P sound in Greek, which maybe there are a couple more examples. But this is also another correspondence that appears regularly. We have a word for salt, starts with sal, basically in all the languages. Greek, as we saw, the S in the beginning turns into sort of this rough breathing. And we know they have a word for a field. So again, we have this sort of gamma and the G corresponding to this sort of K sound in English, acre versus ager or agros. And we have this word for a mill. English cognate is meal in this case, but Greek mili and Latin mola, Hittite malai. So this tells us a lot about their sort of way of life. We know that they had agriculture and that they had animal husbandry, basically. And in particular, I want to draw attention to the word for horse. This is important because horses were not always domesticated throughout history. So this gives us a hint of where and when the Europeans lived back when it was all one language, because there's this common word for horse in all of the languages. Just going through a few more examples just to sort of reiterate these patterns. So body parts, again, you don't expect them to be borrowed. We see this sort of the G in Greek and Latin corresponding to a K in English. The word for foot, English foot, Greek we have the stem pod and Latin ped. So the P and the D, once again, corresponding in the 3 out of the 4 languages, but an F and a T in English. We have the word for the eyebrow, where we see once again this BH in Sanskrit corresponding to a B in English, but a phi in Greek. Once again, the D, D, and the delta, but a T in English, and then the K, 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 with an H in English. And the word for tooth, again, the T sound in English corresponding to a D or a delta in the other languages. And we also have some technology words. So we can reconstruct, or we can notice that there are words for a wheel. So just comparing, for example, the Greek and the Sanskrit, we have this kuklos versus chakram. We see these K's here, but English has this H. In fact, it's a WH, but again, this sort of gives you this H versus K correspondence. And this is also, once again, important to understanding the material culture of the Proto Indo-Europeans, because the wheel was invented around the Caucasus in, I guess, around maybe 3500 BC. So we know they had the wheel technology, therefore we have some hint as to when these languages split up and where they came from, or where was the homeland of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. Some more wheel technology, we have the nave, which is the sort of the center, the hub of a wheel. We see again this sort of phi in Greek corresponding to a BH in Sanskrit, and in English is a V in this case. We also see this in the word for weave, so we know that they had weaving was a part of their lifestyle. Again, the phi and the BH, but the V in English. So once again, I want to summarize some of these sound correspondences. We saw these already, but there's also this one that I mentioned, the gamma and the G in Latin and Greek, but the C or a K in English. And we have this DH in Sanskrit that corresponds to an English D, but a Greek theta. And the Greek phi generally corresponds to a Latin F, but a Sanskrit BH and the English B, or as we saw in some examples, a B. And also this case where there was a WH in English or a QU in Latin, generally corresponding to a T or a P sound in Greek, or some other sounds in Sanskrit, usually a K or a S sometimes. And once again, these sort of deviations that English has is common to the Germanic family called Grimm's Law. And so basically the point I'm trying to make is that once you sort of know about these correspondences, you can kind of start to expect, you know what to expect when looking for cognate words, that is, words that are common in the languages that have a common origin. So if you see a word with an F in English, for example, and you are looking for the Greek analog, you should be looking for the letter I, for instance. And we also saw this one before. Okay, so based on sort of what I mentioned before, the words for the wheel and the words for the horse in particular give a strong indication about where these languages were spoken a really long time ago. So we see the present day distribution of the Indo-European languages within Eurasia. So we see most of Europe as well as Middle East and North India. So it makes sense that they originated somewhere in maybe Eastern Europe, West Asia. And so the most likely hypothesis is the so-called Kurgan hypothesis, where the Proto-Indo-European speakers were sort of north of the Caucasus, which corresponds to the wheel technology, as well as the domestication of the horse, spreading around 3000 BC away from this area into the rest of Europe and then India. All right, so hopefully by now you're at least somewhat convinced that Greek belongs to this family of languages spoken by spoken sort of all over these areas, and that they all come from this mother language that was spoken up here, probably in sort of the Ukrainian steppe. And I just want to pause right now to ask if anyone has any questions so far.
Konstantinos, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you show us that chart again with the different languages?
The family tree, you mean?
I think so. Yes.
Yeah. That was early again. Yeah, so this is a chart that I just sort of took from a book. It doesn't have all the languages. Sorry. Oh, this one?
Yes. That one. Yes.
Yeah. So there's so many languages, and this doesn't even have all of them.
Yes.
And this is the most common, at least these are the most commonly agreed distribution. So, for example, Indic and Iranian are usually grouped together under Indo-European. They're believed to be sort of more, they branched off from each other later in history than, for example, the other languages. But I'll talk a little bit about possible connections that Greek has with the other branches.
One other thing, the different correspondence of the sounds,
right.
I guess they would be pronounced differently than we might pronounce the and the corresponding in another language would be different, right?
Right. Yeah. So
I know that's simplistic, but the GH sound would correspond with the it's more guttural than the in Greek, isn't it?
So which one are you referring to?
The GH in English.
So English doesn't really have a G. I mean, the GH the GH sort of in some earlier versions of English was some kind of a h or a g sound, which is that's why how it was spelled, but it's not pronounced like that anymore in modern English.
No, it's not.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
But yeah, I mean, it's true that these sounds are different, and that's because there was sound change over time. So as you mentioned, some English changed a lot, and this sort of Grimm's law is one of these changes that happened in Germanic, but not in the other branches, for example. But yeah, on the basis of these common sounds, some people are able to sort of propose what the original sound might have been like. But again, there's no actual record for what this sound was. It's just reconstructed based on the similarities.
Right. Thank you.
Any other questions? Wait. All right, so continue. So the next thing I want to talk about, so we talked about how Greek is part of this family. And so we saw the speakers of this Proto Indo-European, they spread out and they split up into all these branches. And I want to say how Greek in particular developed after the speakers sort of went their separate ways, so to speak. So this map is based on some work of Georgiev. This is the so-called Proto-Greek. These are the ancestors of all the Greek dialects. When they entered into Greece, they came probably from the north into Greece. Approximately the 3rd millennium BC, we have this sort of estimate of the range of the speakers. And so between the Indo-European and Proto-Greek, we see certain changes, the language that happened, or certain features that emerged in Greek in particular and in some other languages as well. And these similar developments have led some people to propose certain connections between Greek and some of the other branches. So here is one possible proposed grouping of Greek with other languages. So one cluster is the so-called Greco-Armeno-Indo-Iranian, which groups Greek with Armenian and the Indo-Iranian languages. And there are others who claim that Greek and Armenian are in fact even more closely related to each other. So after the Indo-Iranian branched off, you have this sort of Greco-Armenian proposed group, and even more closely related Greek and Phrygian, this Greco-Phrygian group. Phrygian was a language spoken in Asia Minor in classical times, which is likely closely related to Greek. And then, of course, we have this potential Hellenic family with Greek and ancient Macedonian, likely very closely related languages. Some have suggested that maybe it's even just a slightly divergent dialect of ancient Greek, or it's a very closely related language. So I want to mention some reasons why these are grouped together. So what are these common features that I mentioned? So one kind of interesting similarity that Greek has with these languages and with Armenian and Indo-Iranian is the so-called e-augment in the past tense. So this means that in the past tense, verbs get this vowel added to the front of them. This doesn't appear in the other Indo-European languages, only in Greek, Armenian, and Indo-Iranian languages. So this is one reason why people think they might be closely related. They have this sort of common feature, this common innovation. Another thing they have in common is specifically passive voiced in the aorist. So the other languages don't distinguish between the middle voice and the passive voice, but in the aorist, Greek and Armenian and Indo-Iranian have developed a distinct passive, separate from the middle. And in particular with Sanskrit, Greek shares something called Grassmann's law. This is a phenomenon where if you have two so-called aspirated consonants in the same word, the first one loses the aspiration. So this only Greek and Sanskrit have this possible connection between the two languages. Other similarities that Greek has with Armenian and Phrygian are the so-called prothetic vowels. So you see in certain words, there's a vowel in the front in the Greek word and in the Armenian, but not in the other languages. And so this is believed to come from a certain consonant called laryngeal consonant. I won't talk about that very much, but just the point is that in some languages, this laryngeal turned into a vowel, but in many others it didn't. But in Greek and Armenian and Phrygian it did, so that's one reason to suggest that maybe they're closely related, or at least more closely than to the other branches. But apart from these, Greek also has its own features which are different from all the other branches, even these other closely related branches. One of these is the so-called voiceless aspirates. So I mentioned this a little bit. With the sound correspondence, we saw like a phi corresponding to a BH. In Sanskrit, for example, so a phi is kind of like a PH, and the P is called voiceless. But yeah, the point is that this is sort of a unique development in Greek, whereas the other languages either had it as a BH or as a B. And then this is also this triple reflex, so these laryngeal things that turn into vowels that I mentioned. There's three different sort of flavors of them, and Greek preserves a three-way distinction that the other languages did not preserve. So there's some kind of features that make Greek sort of unique within the family, sort of its own unique branch. And here's just a table of what I just said, basically. So just looking at the first line, we have this verb efere, which is the past tense of fero. We see the same exact word, or the cognate word in Sanskrit, in the past tense has this a in the front. And Armenian has eber, and Phrygian has edas. It's a different verb, but it's the same idea. So they just add this vowel in the front whenever it's past tense, that none of the other Indo-European languages do. So this is some evidence that they might be related. I mentioned this aorist passive. The forms of the passive don't resemble each other. So that's not very strong evidence, but the fact that they have it is sort of interesting. Has led people to suggest the relationship. Grassmann's law, as I mentioned, you have this like tithemi, for example. The first is a T and the second is a TH. So you imagine that originally they were both THs, but the first one lost the aspirations and became a plain T. And in Sanskrit, similarly, this was supposed to be like a BH and a DH, but the first one lost the H. This is the vowel I was talking about. So here's the word for man in many languages. So you have aner, nar, air, anar. And so you see in Sanskrit, it's just nar, no vowel in the front. But Greek, Phrygian, and Armenian have this A in the front. And that is called a prothetic vowel. This is basically like an added vowel that seems to just appear. But we know now that's probably from some kind of consonant that turned into a vowel. We see Macedonian also has this vowel. If we look at the aspirates, as I mentioned, we have this BH in Sanskrit that corresponds to a PH in Greek, whereas the other languages either keep it as a BH like Sanskrit or just turn it into a B. So this is the word for eyebrow that I mentioned earlier. So B in Armenian, Phrygian, Macedonian, but BH in Sanskrit, but PH in Greek. So this is a unique feature. Similarly, the TH for this word, thanatos, death, danon, in Macedonian. So it's a D in the other languages, or a DH. And then this is the sort of triple reflex, these last three examples. Basically, you have these three different vowels that can occur. This E in this A in pater, and the O in dosis. We see Sanskrit, for example, turns them all into this I vowel. And Armenian has two different vowels, but the other languages don't have this three-way distinction that Greek has. So anyway, this is just some of the special developments that Greek had that sort of make it different than the other languages in the family, even though there are also some similarities that it has with these other ones that lead to this potential connection. Okay, so before I go to the last section, are there any questions?
Yeah, Konstantinos, this is Elias Neofytides. The closest dialect to the ancient Greek is the Pontian dialect, which has been over 4,000 years and is still talked, and I am very fluent in the Pontian dialect. Even though I was beat up by the teachers and my parents to stop talking, while I was growing up. So instead of, maybe the next time, you could use those examples too, like you have Macedonian, you had, for Asia Minor, but the Greeks of Pontus stayed more, unique to the Greece because of the place where they were. They weren't, subject to a lot of wars and stuff. And the ancient Pontians came from Ionis, and they were Ionis, and they kept the Greek language more than any other place in Greece. So maybe on your next one, you could add that to it too.
Yeah, I mean, the Pontic, this is sort of the early history. The Pontian is sort of a later, I guess you could say, is like post-classical developments, how Pontic developed differently from the rest of the Greek. But here, this Greek is supposed to be all ancient Greek before the separation between the Pontics from the rest. So yeah, that's also an interesting discussion, but I think it sort of falls into later history or medieval history rather than this early history that I'm talking about.
Yeah, Ilya, this is Alex. All the Greek dialects, with the exception of Tsakonic, which some people consider a separate Hellenic language, have been the descendants of the Alexandrini Kini. the common Greek language that emerged when all the Greek dialects merged around 300 BC in the Hellenistic and 200 BC in the Hellenistic times. And that includes Pontic, Cypriot, Cretan, for example, all the Greek dialects. The only one that actually did not fall in that is Tsakonic, which is a direct descendant of the Doric Greek and not of the Kimi.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Costa.
All right. Any other questions? If not, then I'll...
I have one question.
Oh, yes.
I'd like to clarify. So you are saying that before Sanskrit, the languages really came from the Caucasian area. The Caucasian.
Yes, probably a bit north of the Caucasus, sort of Pontic steppes in Ukraine and Russia.
So that's the origin of Sanskrit.
Yeah, so Sanskrit, all of these languages in this table and in the other previous table that had all of those many branches,
Yes.
yeah, they're believed to all originate from that one language that was spoken like 5,000 or 6,000 years ago in that area.
The Caucasus, is that what you?
It's not exactly the Caucasus, but it was nearby to the Caucasus because.
And what language?
Yes.
What language is that?
So the language is called Proto Indo-European because we don't have a direct record. We just know that it's the ancestor of all the Indo-European languages, so we just call it Proto Indo-European.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right. Did someone post something in the chat? Oh, someone asks, can you elaborate between Greek and Macedonian? Yeah, so the problem with the Macedonian is we don't have very many records of the language. For example, they didn't really have, we don't know if we have any written records except for what some Greek records mentioning certain Macedonian words. So I have a few words here that are the ancient texts claim to be a Macedonian. And yeah, based on those texts and based on how the ancient Greeks and the Macedonians sort of saw each other, we know that they have to be a very, very close relative of Greek or some kind of distant dialect, like very different dialects. So they are very similar, but we don't know exactly in what ways, and there's not enough evidence to really classify it completely. Yes, definitely related very closely. And yes, the statement about the Philip, or more generally, after the Macedonian Empire expanded, then the Attic dialect formed the basis of the new lingua franca, common tongue, and became essentially the official language of Macedon. But there was also this sort of local dialect that they had, which was already very closely related to Attic and the other Greek dialects, but not as closely. I mean, like Attic and Ionian are very close. Macedonian is somewhat a little bit further off, but still very closely related, because you can even tell from these examples, right? There's very similar, just like, for example, the TH versus a D, or the B versus the PH. So these are some of the differences. But yeah, it's not enough to say whether it was a separate dialect or a very closely related language. So it's definitely very closely related. We just don't know exactly how much based on the few texts that are available. Does that answer the question?
If you look at the Kalas people in in Pakistan, Afghanistan, around there, all the people that are thinking they still believe that they are descendants of Alexander the Great, they speak the ancient Greek language. They don't speak any other dialect. So they feel that they're descendants of Alexander the Great. The language they learned and they speak still today, some of my friends that I have in New York, they speak the ancient Greek language. They don't speak any other dialect.
I'm not aware of, so I'm not super familiar with this Pakistan question. But I mean, in any case, it couldn't be the ancient Greek because it would have changed over so many centuries. But yeah, I'm not sure about these varieties that are, if there's variety spoken there. So I can't really say anything about these.
I'll lend you a book. I'll bring it over the next time I see your father, your mother. I'll lend you a book on it that you can study it on it.
All right. Are there any more questions?
I don't know if you can see it. See?
This isn't the end of the lecture, is it?
No. There's one more section. I just wanted to pause before I transition to the next.
Okay. Can I have a bottom line on this? So Sanskrit is not the oldest language in the world. Proto Indo-European is.
No, I mean, all this language is not really well defined. I mean, Sanskrit came from Proto Indo-European, so in some sense, there's a continuity of the same language. But many other languages in the world also, if you go back far enough, you know, they were still speaking some kind of language that changed over all that time. So in some sense, all the languages are probably, you know, tens or hundreds of thousands of years old if you count all of their ancestor languages.
Okay.
So you can't really say one is older than the other. It's just that Sanskrit, for example, is one of the oldest in the sense that we have texts from a very, very early phase in that language.
Okay.
Similarly, there's some really ancient Greek and Hittite texts.
Okay. Now, what is older, Sanskrit or ancient Greek? Is that?
So, I mean, it depends on which phase of Sanskrit and which phase of ancient Greek. But for example, you can go back to like the Mycenaean Greek. That was very old, like probably more than 1500 BC.
Right.
And some early versions of Sanskrit probably were passed down from a variety spoken maybe around that time as well. But yeah, I mean, the point is that these languages eventually slowly became more and more different as they separated from each other and then developed in their own separate ways.
But we still have texts from Sanskrit, and that's.
We have the text, even though the texts are more modern, they correspond to an oral tradition that was very old.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
All right. So, there are no more questions. I want to move to the next sort of final thing that I want to talk about, which is the pre-Greek part of the talk. There we go. But anyway, so the story so far has been, you know, the Proto Indo-Europeans, they have a language, they split up and they go all over Europe and Asia. And then some groups go towards Greece, and that probably includes Greek, Phrygian, maybe Armenian as well. And then eventually they develop in their own ways, but then the Proto-Greeks, so-called speakers, arrive into Greece, and then they come into contact with another group of people who are already there, the previous inhabitants of Greece, the so-called pre-Greeks. So how do we know, and how did they impact each other? How did this contact between the two different peoples affect the language? So we find that in Greek there are a lot of words that don't seem to have an Indo-European explanation. They don't seem to have any cognates with the other Indo-European languages, or the form of the word doesn't even look like it came from an Indo-European root. And in particular, we see this with place names or names of deities, like gods and goddesses, or names of plants and animals. Yes, the question. And this is sort of understandable if you have a population moving into a new area, that the language will sort of adopt the local words for a lot of place names or flora and fauna. Moreover, there are a lot of patterns that seem to recur in a lot of these words. For example, a very famous example is this inth suffix in, for example, the name Corinth or labyrinth. So Corinth is, of course, a place name, and labyrinth is kind of mythological name. And they have this inth, which doesn't really appear in inherited words, that is, in the words that we saw before with the cognates. They don't really have this inth sound pattern, but it does seem to occur in some of these words. And because of this fact, Bakis and Fournet, who studied these words, they suggest that all of these words are borrowed into Greek from this population that was there before, which was either a single language or closely related languages because of these recurring patterns. And these were this language, presumably spoken in Greece before the Proto-Greek speakers arrived into the region. And he calls this language pre-Greek. So yeah, I just don't want to avoid confusion. Pre-Greek referring to the people who were there before Greek was spoken in Greece, and Proto-Greek are the early Greek speakers before it split into any dialects. But yeah, so pre-Greek refers to these substrate people who came into contact with the Indo-European Proto-Greek speakers as they arrived. And we can see some words that came into the Greek language due to this contact. And so I just want to mention some ways that we can know, or at least suspect, that a word might come from pre-Greek as opposed to being inherited from the Indo-European mother language. Is one, for example, we can't find any Indo-European etymology. So if we don't find any cognates, or as I mentioned, it doesn't look like it likely came. The next thing was these common recurring patterns, these common suffixes that occur, especially if they're not very common within inherited words. And the third way is if the word has variants. So in particular, if there's many different versions of the word. So of course, the different dialects maybe have different versions of certain words. But if the variants are so strange that they can't really be explained by dialect differences. So in particular, one very common pattern is a variation between a voiced and a voiceless or aspirated consonant. So for example, like a PH versus a P or a B. This is sort of a sign that maybe this language, this word came from a foreign language and sort of was approximated in several different ways. And that's why these variants exist. And finally, as I mentioned, semantic considerations. If we look at the meaning of the word, is this a word that is likely to be borrowed, like a place name or the name of some local plant or animal species? So with these criteria, Bakis has compiled a big list of words that he believes are pre-Greek. I'll mention just a few here just to give some examples. So place names, as I mentioned, is a very common source of these. So if we look at the name of Athens, we also have this other word of Attica, the region around Athens. And they're actually kind of similar in form, but we see this variation between this theta here and the taf. So this aspirated versus non-aspirated, which is indicating that it might be of pre-Greek origin. We have this Thessaly, so Thessalia, we have this variant where we have Petalia. So you have this, again, aspirated versus non-aspirated. The Mount Olympus is likely a pre-Greek word as well. And some mythological names, so names of maybe gods like Apollon. There's, again, variants that seem kind of strange, like a double L versus a single lambda, and some of the vowels are different. So this, again, is likely of pre-Greek origin. Artemis as well. The hero Achilles. So again, one lambda versus two lambdas. This might be a sign that it's pre-Greek. Hephaestus, Odysseus, for example, we have Odysseus and Ixeus even. So, yeah, if you were wondering why Latin has Ulysses instead of Odysseus, and the varieties already existed within Greek, so it's not just the Latins borrowed it from some version where it had a lambda instead of a delta. This variation is very unusual unless it was borrowed from pre-Greek. And this is very interesting because it shows that a lot of these, of what we consider to be Greek mythology, seems to have come from the culture of the locals who were there before the Indo-European arrival, or at least before this Proto-Greek arrival. Now, some more examples, of course, we have plant names. This is very understandable. Again, if the Indo-Europeans lived in a different place, they didn't have a word for the plant, so they just borrowed the local word for it. For example, the olive tree. The almond has a variation. So we have this sigma and gamma, which is kind of unusual to see a variety or as a variant. Asparagus, again, the aspiration versus the non-aspiration. Snappy, this is, I guess, mustard plant. And some animals, like the whale, there's a variation between a single lambda and a double lambda. Also makes sense if they were living next to the sea, the Proto-Indo-Europeans were not living in a region where there was, like if they were north of the Caucasus, then they wouldn't have had whales, but of course the local people who were living there in Greece do have this. The vulture, this variation is somewhat strange, this vowel in the front. The frog, again, notice this aspiration, the taf versus theta, or the kappa versus the he even. Turtle, again, you have this sort of a double N versus single N. There's some vowel variation as well. So anyway, this is just a small list. There are more proposals, but these words are considered to be likely borrowed into Greek from these pre-Greek speakers. And so finally, I want to sort of mention how, looking at comparing which words are borrowed and which ones are not, or how the borrowed versus the inherited words differ in usage, can tell us about the cultures of these two different people as they were coming into contact. Just to give a concrete example, we have the two words for earth, one which is believed to be pre-Greek, Gaia. You can see the variation in the vowels, whereas we have this Indo-European inherited word, chthon. So they both mean earth, but one is from the pre-Greek, one is from the Indo-European. And in particular, the pre-Greek one also corresponds to the deity, Gaia, the Mother Earth. And so this could indicate that the pre-Greeks perhaps had more focus in their religion on this Mother Earth figure, whereas the Indo-Europeans, as we saw, had this sort of sky god, Zeus, which is clearly Indo-European root. So this could indicate a sort of more, sky people versus the sort of earth, more agrarian, perhaps Mother Earth venerating culture. Another one is the word for the sea. So there's this word thalassa, which has a variant that has this sort of aspiration voicing distinctions, which suggests that it's pre-Greek. But there are also words that are derived from Indo-European that also describe the sea. The first one is just the word for salt. And the second one is derived from a root, so pontos, derived from a root meaning path. So both of these seem to be descriptive, which would sort of make sense. You would create a new word for the sea if you were from a people who didn't really have much sea travel experience, coming into a region where there's much more access to the sea in Greece. And you will, of course, understandably borrow a word that means sea from the local people who probably have much more experience seafaring. Another interesting one seems to be this word for a ruler. So we have, or like a king, we have anax and basileus. These words seem to be of pre-Greek origin. Contrast with this word koidanos, kind of a rare word that seems to be Indo-European. So this might suggest that the way that societies were organized or ruled by rulers was different between the pre-Greeks versus the incoming Indo-Europeans, and in particular, that possibly the Greeks adopted this sort of pre-Greek way of organizing society, and so they used the words that were a bit more appropriate for like king, versus we know some other Indo-European languages kept another word which seems to suggest more of simply this sort of arbiter kind of role. So anyway, what I mean is that the Indo-European culture didn't really have the same kind of notion of king that the pre-Greeks had, and so that's why you borrow this word that fits the role better. So instead of making up a new word, you just sort of use the word that other people have, the pre-Greeks. And similarly, there are these two words related to battle and war that are also possibly pre-Greek. It's a bit, I put question marks because these are somewhat more dubious. But again, this could also indicate that the way that war was conducted between the Indo-Europeans versus the pre-Greeks, they have different traditions in war as well. So the Indo-Europeans being semi-nomadic pastoralists, probably maybe were more raid oriented, so they had raids instead of like formal war. But yeah, these are some ways comparing these words to sort of gain an insight into this culture of the pre-Greeks that, was basically kind of absorbed into the Greek culture. We can still see sort of the cultural differences that existed when the two cultures came into contact. And even though the pre-Greek language, is not spoken anymore, we can still extract some information about the language and the culture from these borrowed words. So yeah, that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much for your attention. Any questions?
Συγχαρητήρια, πολύ ωραία δουλειά, Κώστα.
Κύριε Κώστα. Μπράβο, Κωνσταντίνε.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Πολύ ωραία, ευχαριστούμε.
Κωνσταντίνε, με ακούς? Δημήτρης Γιαννημάρας εδώ.
Ναι, σε ακούω.
Ωραία. Σε ευχαριστώ πολύ. Είναι προσωπικά εγώ το βρίσκω πολύ ενδιαφέρον το θέμα και το αναπτύσσεις καλά. Μπράβο. Έχω μία ερώτηση. Στα αρχαία ελληνικά και στα σύγχρονα εν μέρη υπάρχουν τρεις λέξεις για το ξύφος. Ξύφος, ρομφαία και φάσγανο. Ποιο από αυτά τα τρία είναι ίσως πρωτοελληνικό?
Για αυτές τις λέξεις δεν είμαι σίγουρος. Βασικά, για να δω, να μην είναι σωστό. Υπάρχει ένα λεξικό, το Etymological Dictionary, και αυτό το έγραψε εκείνος που που έχει αυτή τη pre-Greek θεωρία.
Ναι.
Και όλες αυτές, βασικά μόνο αυτό το λεξικό έχει αυτή την έρευνά του. Τα προηγούμενα λεξικά δεν είναι πολύ τα... Βασικά ή έλεγαν άγνωστη ετυμολογία και κάτι τέτοια.
Συγγνώμη, πώς λέγεται αυτός είπες?
Bakers, Robert Bakers. Basically, παράδειγμα, μπορώ να κοιτάξω γρήγορα εδώ, αλλά ναι, εδώ λέει Ξύφος πιστεύει αυτός να είναι pre-Greek και τι variation. Oriental origin. Okay, some suggest that it's related to some Semitic. It might be borrowed from Semitic.
Για το Ξύφος.
Some form have skiff, so that's a variation that might point to pre-Greek, or that could be borrowed from some other language. Yeah, I think one of the issues with this pre-Greek is sometimes you can't tell if it's just borrowed from maybe some other language that we don't know about, maybe like an Anatolian language like Lydian or something, unless we have some specific Lydian word to compare it to, or if it's possibly this pre-Greek language. So that's why the variants are useful, but also the patterns, these sort of recurring patterns that I mentioned, these sort of common features might also be.
Yeah, a couple of things on that one. That some of the etymologies of pre-Greek word are contested. For example, the word for Vasilevs. There is a contest that says, well, maybe it is really Indo-European in origin. It is from Pasi Reu, being a very ancient word for king in Indo-European language, like Rex. Or the word for Sinapi, which has a cognate in German, like in Senf, and so on. So that's one part. The other is indeed, as Konstantinos very well started explaining, there is a Semitic sort of set of loan words into Greek. An interesting example might be the word for good, kalos. That word did not exist in Proto Indo-European, and of course kalos, one can argue, especially since it was originally spelled with double L, that it may have had to do with the Semitic root for kalos, like halal, for example, in modern Arabic, as in halal meat, or halali, as we say in modern Greek. So there is also that third aspect, words like Chrysos, for example, sort of Semitic origin. So that's sort of a third kind of substrate that went into the creation of Greek.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, and I should have mentioned probably that a lot of these pre-Greek theories are, as kind of by their very nature, are going to be sort of controversial. I mean, Bakis included mostly words that were not very controversial, but there are several other ones which are much more contested. I mean, Bakis even suggests anthropos to be pre-Greek, but there are Indo-European explanations that are also plausible for this word, and many other words have sort of this debate going on. So yeah, I wanted to emphasize sort of that it's interesting that we might be able to extract some information about the pre-Greeks, but again, a lot of this stuff is still, incomplete, and probably we might not be able to ever have a definite answer.
Konstantinos.
Yes.
Konstantinos, I'd like to make two comments to very comprehensive about the origins of Greek, but there's two things we're missing in my view. The relationship between the Greeks, the Greek language, and the Phoenicians, and also about the Pelasgians. Are they pre-Greeks or proto-Greeks, or what kind of Greeks are they according to this phylogenetic tree?
Yes, so for the first part, Phoenicians are so the Phoenicians were, a Semitic group that existed in the Eastern Mediterranean. So of course, they had contact with the Greeks and influenced the culture a lot. And so for the Pelasgian, that's sort of an interesting, some people would call that pre-Greek Pelasgian. And Pelasgian seems to be sort of a generic word for like the ancestors of all the Greeks in some sense. And some people, when they first suggested this pre-Greek hypothesis, called it Pelasgian, but believed that it was Indo-European and tried to find its place on the tree. Bacchus, however, disagrees with this and says that's probably not Indo-European. So he doesn't call it Pelasgian anymore, but calls it pre-Greek. But it's likely that they might refer to the same group. But there are many different words. For example, like the Minoans, where do they fit also? That's a good question. Were they also speaking this pre-Greek, or was this yet another indigenous group that had a separate language? And yeah, it's not clear. And it's hard to really separate between some of these substrates, so to speak. And yeah.
I understand. Thank you. Thank you.
There's also another question in the chat that says, can you remind us when the Indo-European language came to Greece? Yeah, so it seems that we know that definitely by the Bronze Age, like Mycenaeans were speaking Greek, so that's like 2nd millennium BC. They had already arrived. So probably they were arriving in the 3rd millennium, so between 3000 and 2000 BC. There's another question. Is there another question?
Yeah, there are two questions actually. Look at the question that I have, and also another person has, both of us, Dr. Petropoulos, okay, about DNA evidence, especially in reference to what you said with Baker, who seems to be a bit speculative. That's one question. I also have a second question, which is, what is the relationship of the Greek language, the Indo-European, and the language of Crete, the archaic language of Crete as we know it from Grammiki Vita, the linear B? Thank you.
Okay, so I'll do the linear B first. So linear B is different from linear A. So linear B writes some version of Greek, and it was used by the Mycenaeans, who spoke a variety of really early Greek. But it seems like they borrowed this script from the people who are using the linear A, which is used to write a different language, which we don't know what that language was. Even if we can read the sounds, it doesn't correspond to any known language. I guess you could say Minoan. If this is a language, what was it? We don't really know. Maybe it's connected to this pre-Greek thing of Bacchus, maybe not. For the DNA question, I mean, this is sort of a complicated question, but basically I want to emphasize that DNA and sort of genetic drifts can be useful to try to find population movements, but that genetics and language do not correspond all the time, one-to-one. And so it's possible that some groups can, become assimilated into another group, can start speaking a different language because maybe some elite came over to rule over them. You can just look at colonial languages in Africa or in the Americas, right? In Africa, they speak French in many countries doesn't mean that they're genetically French or descended from French people from France. And that's sort of an extreme example, but yeah, so the DNA question about Greece, I think there are some papers of Lazaridis. So if you want to look at those, probably he has some idea about that.
Konstantinos, the most important thing is what is your personal opinion. We are not, look, we cannot get into personally, me or anybody else, into a different type of expertise right now and start making linguistics papers. But what is your personal, you may have looked at those or you may have not. What is your personal understanding and your personal feeling? Because languages were spoken by people, and if they were spoken by people, we need to be able to find some evidence that these kind of people lived in the area, especially when Indo-European has no written has no written evidence.
So there are, yeah, I mean, I have looked at this, not a linguistic paper. Lazaridis is a geneticist. I think the papers are mainly about sort of comparing Minoan and Mycenaean. And basically his conclusion is that they're very similar genetically, but presumably linguistically they're very different. So it seems like when the language entered the area, of course some speakers entered who had a somewhat different DNA, but the impact was not enormous. So for example, I mean, not even an example, just, yeah. So it seems like there are certain things that the geneticist can trace inside the DNA to sort of follow these Indo-European migrations. And especially in this so-called Y DNA, which is the paternal line, which sort of remains unchanged. There are certain things that are found, especially in Western Europe, that seem to be associated with this. They also are found in Greece, but in Greece there are many other ones as well. So it seems like Greece, I mean, is obviously has had many migrations happen over time. But even besides that, the Greek language has somehow, for historical or other reasons, basically kind of prevailed in Greece. So despite all of these migrations, the Greek people, there's a bunch of contact between all sorts of groups and populations. But yeah, I mean, Greece is just essentially some kind of mix of all of these. But culturally and linguistically, the core is this Indo-European thing, with, of course, borrowings throughout history. I mean, we know a lot of borrowing of modern Greek, but I guess the point I was trying to make with this speech is that even the ancient Greeks, of course, had words that were borrowed and not quote unquote pure Indo-European. Of course, there's no pure language, but yeah, I guess the point is that there's a lot of language contact, and you can see that in the language. And of course, there's also contact between people, but you see that in the DNA, but it's not a one-to-one correspondence. So it might be that the pre-Greek genetically had a bigger impact on the ancestry of the ancient Greeks, but linguistically, of course, they're still speaking the Indo-European language. And this is why one sort of dominated the other. You could say it's sort of history, like maybe the wheel technology and the horses kind of gave them some sort of strength, or whatever other reasons. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Konstantinos. And with this, I would like to say hi to everyone and also announce that we have an event for the Cultural Center tomorrow about the 2,500 years from the Battle of Salamis at 2 p.m. Starts at 2 p.m. tomorrow, in line by Microsoft Teams. We'll send you the link in the chat. Thanks a lot. Okay?
Σας ευχαριστούμε.
There's also a question about how many words are pre-Greek. Yeah, I mean, I don't know the exact proportion. So if you believe Bakis, he has even a book about pre-Greek. But I think his book has maybe around like few thousand, around 1,000 or so examples. So I mean, this decent amount is definitely a decent proportion.
I have personally subscribed to all the channels, also the HCC info and the Elias channel, because that helps, but you need a subscription. Keep that in mind. If you watch, subscribe, please.
Κωνσταντίνο, θέλω να σε ευχαριστήσουμε εκ μέρους του HPST για την πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα διάλεξη. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It was, I think all of us found it very interesting and
Can I ask a
learning new things. Thank you.
Can I ask one last question?
Yeah.
How, Konstantine, did you correlate this interest in languages with low-dimensional topology?
I mean, it's just, yeah, I don't know. I guess I have various interests. I had taken these classes and sort of done some of these studies in undergrad that had some linguistic and mathematical interests, so I sort of followed them in undergrad. I mean, nowadays I don't really take classes outside of math, but still I like to, look at some interesting linguistic book or something from time to time.
Okay, all right. Because it's more close to information theory and coding theory, I would say linguistics.
I mean, there is some computational linguistics, but I wouldn't say that I know very much about that. Yeah, I mean, there's sort of just like mostly separate interests, but I just have both interests.
All right, thank you very much. And good job. Congratulations for your touching this complicated matter.
Yeah. Well, thanks again. And
before closing, you can take a look at the chat. There are several announcements, and so you can access the videos. They can send it to you. There is also the announcement, the link for tomorrow, the Battle of Salamis, the event. So please take note of this, because when we log out, everything is getting erased. If there are no more comments, thank you everybody for participating, for joining us, and until next time, stay safe. Bye-bye.